Are you afraid to die? The age-old question. And I believe it's a question that's going to be asked for another age onwards. It always comes down to whenever humans are thinking about what it is to live, the question of what it is to die comes up as well. And whether or not you should be afraid and what happens after. And all of these questions have plagued us for centuries upon centuries upon centuries. Now, this seemingly insignificant question has actually had a lot of really big impact on humans in general, whether that be on a societal or individual level. Because how can we truly live without questioning what that life is worth, how that life ends, and so much more? So today, I'm going to be showing you how it is that the question of death shapes not only ourselves, but our societies. Just one of the ways you can see death's impact on society is how often it's expressed and reflected in media. The example I'm going to use for this is The Dark Side of the Moon, Pink Floyd's incredibly famous concept album that marked the beginning of really concept music and trying to express complex philosophical ideas through music and media, right? So the album itself tells a very, very interesting story, and it focuses around the one of the lead singers of Pink Floyd losing his mind and his insanity and everything that comes with that. But really, what the album is about is criticizing not only societal ideals, but what that does to us on a personal level. For example, right, the album really tries to drive home a perspective and philosophy of living life to the fullest, of being in the moment and appreciating every single second. And you see this through, especially through the songs Time and Breathe. Time talks extensively about making sure that you are doing what you want with your time, or else you will regret it. It talks about waiting for society to tell you that your life has begun, which is one of the more interesting parts about our society, is that we all wait and think that our life begins at university when we're in high school, or when we're in elementary school, we think it starts at high school. When we're in high school, we think it starts at university. When we're in university, we think it starts at our degree, and we keep pushing back the date of the start of our lives. But what many people often fail to realize is that all those days that are passing in that time, well, that's your life, right? Look at the song title, Breathe. It's all about breathing and stopping to take a couple seconds to appreciate what you're looking at, appreciate that sunset or those waves or anything that you're seeing, right? And one of the most beautifully written passages of the album, in my opinion, that really, really serves as almost a thesis for what they're trying to say is, all you touch and all you see is all your life will ever be. Now, this is a really interesting way at looking at life and death. They aren't much concerned about what happens after death or what it means to die, but in fact, truly concerned on what it is to live and what you should do while living. And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. And throughout their songs, they even talk about how there's a couple of songs that highlight the fact that they're not afraid to die, right? That death is a part of everything. And that we'll see connects intensely to the Epicurean philosophy of looking at things. But another interesting, really interesting perspective that comes out of this album is in the song Us and Them. In that song, it is highlighted about how trivial wars can be and how lives are thrown around with no meaning at all, and how often the soldiers' lives are thrown at each other, and when you think that you're fighting against the devil, you think that you're fighting against the other side, but at the end of the day, it's just people trying to live out their lives. And that connects really, really interestingly to the next form of media that I think really reflects death's impact on not only society, but culture, being Slaughterhouse-Five.
So, Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. is one of the more influential anti-war books and truly quite a classic. This book follows Kurt Vonnegut telling a story about his own experiences in World War II, but he does it in a very, very creative lens. Now, the way Kurt Vonnegut goes about describing his experience is with a non-linear timeline. Now, as quantum physics is developing and expanding, and we explore more and more the ideas of a non-linear timeline when it comes to reality itself, it's quite the interesting philosophical idea that he tackles here. And it really is quite revolutionary if you think about how long ago he wrote this and how he kind of predicted certain things without having any of this quantum mechanic knowledge. But that isn't where the true commentary of Slaughterhouse-Five lies. I think that is where the true commentary Slaughterhouse-Five is trying to go at is how we look at death. So Kurt Vonnegut in this story follows a man who believes he's kidnapped by aliens. Now, these aliens, the Tralfamadorians, they see time in this nonlinear fashion. They see time all occurring at once, all moments on a big spectrum rather than a arrow as we tend to see it. Or if you think about it, they see the loaf of the universe, or the loaf of space-time, so to speak. And so these aliens having this four-dimensional sight, well, they don't really place much value upon death or in fact, upon any negative experience, because in every moment that you feel pain or every moment that you're dead, there's countless other moments happening simultaneously where you're very alive and having a great time. So it really takes away from any sort of pain. Now, the famous phrase that comes up whenever you speak of this book is "so it goes." So it goes is the trademark phrase of these aliens, and you see it said after every death in the story, which frankly is many. And there's many different interpretations of "so it goes." And some people believe that it's propelling a philosophy of fatalism, that nothing matters, that everything is predetermined. Fatalism being the idea that, okay, well, if all moments are happening simultaneously, then everything has already been predetermined, and therefore we have no agency. It's just fate. Now, I don't think that's what Vonnegut Jr. is trying to say here. I think "so it goes" speaks to acceptance, speaks to the acceptance of death, and in a way plays into fatalism and inevitability. But I don't think it's about having no choice, but I think it's about accepting what happens and continuing to make change from there. Now, of course, there has to be a little bit of inevitability when you talk about death, because death is inevitable, right? So if you look at these philosophies, similar to how the dark side of the moon expressed acceptance, maybe accepting death isn't a bad thing. Maybe it can be quite a good thing. And in fact, when you don't and try actively to repel against it, that's where you see a lot of pain, grief, anxiety, and a lot of really interesting sentiments or even fear, right? But one of the most interesting parts of this book that refers to inevitability and death in general is how it looks at war. As I mentioned earlier, this is a war novel, and it is all about World War II. Within that, Kurt Vonnegut does a great job of setting the stage and showing how gruesome World War II was through his own experience. And in a way, he does talk about how meaningless lives are. He talks about how many people died during that war. There's the whole interpretation of the Tralfamadorians believing that nothing really matters if everything is happening at the same time. But what makes me think that Vernon Jr. isn't trying to propel a philosophy of meaninglessness, but instead a philosophy of acceptance and trying to make change within that is this quote right here. Is it an anti-war book? Yes, I said, I guess. You know what I say to people when I hear they're writing anti-war books? No. What do you say? I say, why don't you write an anti-glacier book instead? This quote right here is one of the most interesting lines in some of the most interesting lines in the entire novel. Now, what this quote is saying is that, oh, well, you might as well try to stop a glacier as much as you can stop war. Or, in other words, war is inevitable. But in doing that, Kurt Vonnegut published the book all the same. In saying that, okay, you're fighting this indomitable machine, this huge mountain that is war, that is so deeply ingrained into our society, but you're still fighting. You're still creating something. Now, that I think is a really, really good philosophy, and it's almost in line with what the dark side of the moon is trying to say. And what I think should be said in general is that there has to be a certain level of acceptance, but you also have to believe in agency. If humans start forgetting that we have agency or thinking that we don't, then what becomes of the human race? What becomes of our own lives? That's not going to lead to personal or societal satisfaction. But another really interesting part of this book is that, as I mentioned earlier, there are many interpretations. There's many interpretations of the phrase "so it goes," and there's many interpretations of the book in general. Some people think Billy, or the main character that Kurt Vonnegut writes, is simply suffering from PTSD. He leaves that door very open. There's the whole debate of whether time works like that or not. There's a lot of very open doors, which is really characteristic of postmodernity, which is really characteristic of postmodern media. Similar to The Dark Side of the Moon, Kurt Vonnegut never really released an official answer, oftentimes saying that the answer is meant to be created for yourself. And what I find really interesting is that in both of these cases, right, they are clearly a demonstration of a postmodern society. And you see how art and media reflect society throughout history. But with these two, what I find really interesting is that you can kind of connect how they look at death and how what that has to do with postmodernity in general. In both of these cases, they accept death and instead they try to focus on living and agency and what you can do in life. And this ends up to them understanding that there can be many answers. They don't know what happens after death, and that's okay. That is a very postmodern way of looking at things. And it's really interesting to see how the philosophies behind death really drive societal views. Because the next example I'm going to talk about does just the same, but very much so in the opposite. So, Christianity and religion is where I think you start to see the widespread societal impact of the philosophies behind death. Now, religion and death are very, very intertwined. Religion in itself serves as an answer to not only death, but many of the other questions that we can't seem to answer ourselves. Now, it's very different than science in the sense that it's based morely in feeling, spirituality, and culture. But across the board, all religions have some sort of answer for what happens after you die. Now, whatever this answer is tends to drive the values and philosophies of that religion. But the one I want to look at is Christianity. Christianity being the most practiced religion in the world and having some of the most dominant spans of time, which you see through the Middle Ages. Now, Christianity and religion in general are really, really interesting because, as we've looked at before, with death in media, Christianity and religion are reflections of culture, but I think they are so on a much, much deeper perspective. Now, when regards to Christianity and what it tries to say and the values that it propels, there are many. And in a way, it is very good with the whole sins and atonement and trying to be a good person. It does propel morals and unified morals, which is very, very good. But there are certain drawbacks when it comes to the values it promotes and its philosophies on death. Now, these drawbacks to me can be seen in this quote from the Bible. If we live for the Lord. And if we die for the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we belong to God. Now, these words right here are really quite important, and I think they sum up a lot of the bigger flaws with the Christian philosophy. Now, when you die in Christianity, your spirit separates from your body, and you either go to heaven or hell, deemed upon where God judges you should be through your actions in life. And this connects to this quote right here, because when you're living, all the good or bad deeds that you do, according to the Christian religion, it defines what happens in your afterlife. That's how they promote their values. But the problem is, as you can see in this quote right here, what ends up happening is that if you're living to do what Christianity say is right, and in this quote, you're living for God, are you still living your life entirely, or are you living for the afterlife? Because you see, Christians place a lot, or Christianity places a lot of importance on the afterlife and importance on God, so much so that, especially during the Middle Ages, you start to see what happens when a society no longer has a more in the moment or Epicurean way of thinking, but instead a very fatalistic perspective. Because if everything is God's plan and everything has been written by God, then your actions don't mean so much and you only live as God's vessel. It takes a lot of meaning away and takes a lot of human agency away. And where you start to run into problems with this is when you look at what happened during the Dark Ages. Now, through death on the cross, Jesus pays the penalty for humankind's sin, and humankind's relationship with God is restored. As you can see here, it just goes back to reaffirming the idea of sins and atonement and doing what Christianity says is right. And during the Middle Ages, Christianity, or God's say, was the law, it was the truth, it was everything. There was no opposing. So if this fatalistic philosophy is the dominating one, you start to run into a stagnant world, like you saw in the Middle Ages. Not much changed in the Middle Ages, not much was developed. It was a very closed-minded time where quality of life was at an all-time low. Human rights were at an all-time low. Happiness was at an all-time low. Like new inventions and creativity and human evolutions was at an all-time low. Because there was no emphasis placed on living a fulfilling life and a good life, but only on having an afterlife that, frankly, there was no proof of, society became stagnant and an unhappy place to live and exist. Because you see, the problem or the difference with the Middle Ages to now is that Christianity had a very clear set philosophy. And of course, religion can be interpreted in many different ways and it applies to everyone differently. But at this time, that wasn't how religion was thought of. As I said, God's words were the law, they were the truth. And so having such a defined answer, such a one answer, meant that there was no room for creativity or for humans to evolve as there is today. See, this is a lot more characteristic of a modern society. A modern society even is grounded in science and knowledge, which we'll get to in a second. But I say it's like a modern society in the sense that there is only one truth. And whether that is correct or not, I really believe that the spectrum on where society should lie should be a spectrum between postmodern and modern. It should be a lot more gray than one or the other. Because as you can see, when you take away freedom of thought and creativity, you have a lot of problems and you run into a society like the Dark Ages. And that is where you really see how influential the philosophies upon death are, because they controlled people so much that they, on a wide scale, ended up controlling society. So, human curiosity is where I think death is at its most broad, where death is at its most wide-scaped, because this whole entire conversation that we've been having about different views upon death and what happens and what they mean and how they impact, they're all driven by this curiosity. Why do we care what happens after we die? Well, we care because humans are curious. In fact, very curious. So when we're presented with a problem that we can't really solve, it only feeds into our curiosity more and more and more. Now, many animals are curious. It's a big part of survival. If a baby isn't curious to learn new things, then they will never learn how to survive. So curiosity in itself is quite innate. And there are even genes that are connected to being curious and seeking out new things. But where humans take it one step further is that we begin to question and be curious about things that a monkey, for example, can't really fathom. I think humans' curiosity is even more exaggerated because we can conceptualize things on a more complex level than a monkey, for example. A monkey doesn't question its existence, at least not as we know of. It doesn't question what happens after death. It doesn't question how the universe started, because its brain isn't complex enough to understand, think about, and want to question these kinds of things. Curiosity also has a very physical component in humans. When you look at what part of the brain curiosity stimulates, it's the part most associated with hunger and thirst, quite literally proving the thirst for knowledge. When we don't know something, we are physically and fundamentally motivated to find out. And once we do learn something new or satisfy curiosity, a hit of dopamine is released, and all the areas of the brain related to reward go off. So there is that physical component as well. But what really, I think, drives human curiosity is all of the unanswered questions there are in the world. So, as I said before, us humans can conceptualize things that no other animal really can. And we're the first to be able to conceptualize things at such a high level. So that's where I think a lot of the curiosity comes from as well, is that, well, the world's very undiscovered. Maybe once you look at in the evolution into AI, maybe AI has less curiosity than we do because humans discovered a lot more, and they're in a world much less riddled with question marks. But you can see kind of the power of curiosity when looking for where curiosity comes from, you know? Because as much as I've stated all of these things, we don't exactly know specifically why it is that humans are so curious. In fact, it's a question that psychologists are still researching to this day, and there's still new theories and evidence to be proved. So we are curious about curiosity. You can kind of see the circularness there, right? You can kind of see how that begins to become tautological, which means circular, and repetitive. But that truly is how it goes. And one of the most important parts of curiosity, I think at least, is philosophy. When you look at what philosophy is, like finding new and structured ways to think, that is only possible because humans are curious, because we have a drive to want to learn and to want to think. A monkey can't really engage in curiosity because it can't think at a high enough level to think about how to think. Does that make sense? philosophy being patterns in how we look at the lives and think about things, patterns that any other animal can't really grasp. So one of the biggest, if you look at the biggest questions of philosophy, things like death, things like existence, things like purpose, they are questions that can't be answered. They are the question marks, as I mentioned earlier, that are riddled throughout our world. And what you'll find is just like the question of where curiosity comes from, they end up becoming quite circular, and we still can't produce an answer. One of the greatest examples of philosophy, curiosity, and death specifically is Epicurus. So, Epicurus is a really, really good example of not only human curiosity and philosophy, but the nature of the question of death and the really circular paths it leads us on. Now, one of Epicurus's most famous and thesis-like statements about his views on death is as such: as long as we exist, death is not with us. But when death comes, then we do not exist. So, what this statement is trying to say is that death is not a problem while you're living. And once you die, you're not living anymore. So you don't have any more problems. So death isn't really a bad thing or a thing that should be feared or a thing that should be thought about very much. And this fits really well into Epicureanism as a whole. Epicureanism is like the antithesis to Stoicism. They believe in doing what you want and living a life full of happiness where you follow your desires and do everything that which you can to live a life full of happiness and experiences. And me myself, I think Epicurus is on quite a good track to what the ideal reality, truth, or philosophy, whatever it is you want to call it, truly is. The problem, however, with Epicurus's philosophy specifically about death is that, well, okay, so if we don't exist after we die, and therefore death is not a bad thing, what about the life that we had? Because one of the staples of Epicureanism is appreciating life and living and how good life is and all the wonderful experiences it can bring us. So if we die, then we are no longer living. It's taking away from all that good. This is called the harm thesis, right? It states that death is a bad thing because death prevents us from living, and living is intrinsically good, right? So if some of that is taken away from us, that means death is a bad thing. Now, once you start to consider these two questions, it arises even more questions. Like, okay, well, all of this, whenever we talk about life and death, it seems to be very structured towards humans, right? All of this philosophy and thought and circulation of arguments really only started with humans because we are the first to be able to conceptualize such complicated thoughts, right? So if that's the case, then do the same principles of life and death apply to plants, for example? What is life? Like, we all agree that a plant is alive, but a lot of times when we're talking about life as humans, we associate it to the power to change things or to act or to make decisions, or life is more of a story of experiences. Because if you ask many about living as someone with like intense brain function impairment, is that really life? Right? So then you start to question death as well, because we often refer to death as being a state, right? Something is dead. But if something is dead, then it still exists. So you do still exist after you die. So then there can still be problems applied to you. As you can see, it's just this never-ending continuous circle that doesn't really go anywhere, but is always going. Now, this, I think, is really, really important, and it speaks to humans on both an individual level and a societal level. Now, to wrap things up, I want to talk a little bit about my thoughts and tie a little bit of everything that we've talked together, tie it all together. So if we look at Epicureanism and the circular nature of philosophy, the circular nature of its stances towards death, and also curiosity, it ties really well into postmodernism, right? So Epicurus is a very, very old philosopher from all the way back in ancient Greece. And yet, what does that have to do with postmodernism then? Because postmodernism is a much newer thing. Well, if you think about postmodernism in general, right, it's the idea of relativism and multiple truths. It fits really well into all of these things that I've talked about, all of the contradictions and conflict that there is between the ideas of death and what comes after. And you see this reflected in media with The Dark Side of the Moon and Slaughterhouse-Five. Like The Dark Side of the Moon, really, in my opinion, being the first postmodern album. And so once us as humans, we start to think on such a complex level and really contemplate our own life and death, it expands because the logic, or so to speak, that we use to assess life and death starts to apply itself everywhere else. And we start to get more contradictions everywhere else. And start to get more relativism everywhere else. So I really think that, and then if you apply that again to the Dark Ages, you see how, with their whole entire philosophy being very different about death, it being a very concrete, you know, structured in religion, this is what happens, this is what you need to do, it leads to a much less postmodern society, right? And so I think that's a connection that we tend to look over a lot. We tend to look over not only the impact of this question of death as just a conversation starter or another meaningless debate for high-minded aristocrats to endlessly talk. And it certainly does get there. You know, there's hundreds of thousands of words written of philosophy about what happens after death, and a lot of it is trivial, talking about definitions and words and trying to specify something that may not even be able to put into a box, something that maybe as humans we can't even possibly comprehend. And yet we still do it because we're curious and because we want to know. As for what I think the answer to this age-old question is, I'm not quite sure. Um, I don't think I can ever give you an answer. In fact, I'm not sure there ever will be one. But I'll tell you this. I think that a true enlightenment or a truly smart person or the true nature of philosophy is to take bits and pieces from everything that you learn. Often we talk about thesis and antithesis, modernism and postmodernism, Epicureanism and Stoicism, and we put them in these big separate boxes. But I really think that's just to prove a point. You know, it's a lot easier to create an argument or to try to convince someone of something if you're strong in your conviction. But I think true knowledge and true philosophy lies in the gray, lies in mixing all of these things together. So if I had to put life and death into one sentence, I would use this one from Slaughterhouse-Five. All those days that came and went, little did I know that they were life. I think that has been one of the most profound things I've ever read. You know, it ties into Dark Side of the Moon, talking about waiting for the starting gun. It ties into the difference between this kind of philosophy and religion, as religion wasn't quite worried about what life was, but what the afterlife was. And it really ties into Epicureanism with appreciating the moment and trying to live. So I think that's the best way to look at it. I think that as much as curiosity is the pillar of the Western world and philosophy has led us to so many great decisions, I think that we need to step back and we need to appreciate this vessel that we're given to experience love and happiness and sunsets and lasagna, you know? Because All of these wonderful, wonderful things can only happen because we live. So what, who really cares about what happens after we die? A lot of people apparently, but that's just me. So I'll leave you with that, and maybe you can give me an answer.